So let's go to Visual Studio. And the first one we'll take a look at is our for loop. Now, a for loop has a very specific structure that C# is looking for in the syntax checker. We'll make sure that you do this correctly. The keyword is for, so we will start our for loop off with that keyword. And then within the parentheses of our for loop, this is very important for the structure of the for loop, we have 3 separate sections that are separated by this semicolon. So we have 2 semicolons separating our 3 sections. The first one is known as the initializer. So we're creating a variable. In this case, this is an integer data type. I've called it counter because I like my variable names to be meaningful. And we're going to set that equal to 0. So as we start counting through the loop, I want to start at 0. The reason I start at 0 is because for the most part, all computer counting starts at 0, including arrays and different collections that you might deal with later. So it's easier for you to think of it if you're working with 0 as your beginning point right from the get-go. So our initialization portion says I want to create a new counter variable that I will use to control the execution of my for loop. I initialize it to 0. Then I have to set up a condition. And this condition is what we use to actually stop the execution of the loop. If we don't put a condition in here, or if we mess up on our condition, we can create something known as an infinite loop. And I remember one author, as I was learning my programming, specifically stated something that I thought was a little comical. He said, an infinite loop created by a programmer is rather comical when it comes to other programmers looking at it, but not so funny for the programmer who created it. What happens when you create an infinite loop is that whatever code is executing inside that loop will continue to execute, and typically it takes some kind of a special keystroke to stop that execution. So infinite loops are not always good. Sometimes you may want to create one for a specific purpose. We won't go into that here, but remember, you should have some way of stopping your loop, and that is what the comparison portion of your loop does. So the counter less than 10. So what we're saying here is, I want to continue my loop as long as this variable remains less than 10. Then there's the increment portion of the loop. And this is very important as well, because without the increment portion of the loop, we could also create an infinite loop. If I don't increment my counter each time I step through this loop, this value of 0 will never reach the value of 10. In other words, my loop will never stop. So it will also create an infinite loop as well. Inside the loop, so we surround the code we want executing as a part of that loop with these curly braces. And inside the loop is the C# statement that I want to have execute. Now in this case, all we're going to do is write out to the console window what the value of that counter variable is. Before I execute this, I want to create something called a breakpoint. This is Visual Studio's way of allowing you to debug your application, to go in and take a look if there's any issues or problems within the application. And it will start the code and then pause it wherever I have set this breakpoint. It will pause that line of code. The reason I want to do that is because it's important for you to understand how this for loop actually functions and how the different components and pieces get executed. Visual Studio provides really nice color highlighting for each area of the code that gets executed. And we'll see how that plays out here in just one second. Let's start the debugging of the application. So Visual Studio compiles it very quickly. There's not much code here. Our console window popped up briefly and went away because we popped right back into Visual Studio where we're in our debug. So we hit the breakpoint, Visual Studio is paused, and you'll notice that as it's stepping into our for loop, it's highlighted the initialization portion. Now, I can use these buttons up here, step into, step over, etc. We're going to use the step into, which means I want to execute this code one line at a time. So as I step into my code, you'll notice that the next thing Visual Studio does is it highlights counter less than 10. So it's checking my condition, and it says, hey, is counter less than 10? Now, if I hover over it, you'll see that it says true here, and that basically means that the loop is going to execute. If I step into it, you might think that I'm going to execute this portion next, but I won't. Instead, what happens is we look at our open curly brace, we execute the console.writeLine counter, and we go to our closing curly brace, and just if you're curious, we'll pop up the console window so you can see that it did actually print out 0. So this is what we had hoped it would do. So it printed out 0. Back in Visual Studio, watch what happens when I click Step Into. Now Visual Studio goes up and will execute the increment portion. So even though it's in the header of our for loop, this increment portion does not get executed until our loop has gone through at least the first iteration or at least one iteration. And on each iteration at the end, that counter will increment. Now it hasn't incremented yet. Counter still equals 0. If I step into it F11, then counter has now equal to 1. If you'll notice, the highlight immediately went to the condition check and didn't do the initialization all over again. We only initialize once at the beginning of the loop. We check for every iteration of the loop in our conditional, and then we increment the portion. So that's essentially what we're doing here. Now I'm just going to press the F5 key, which will cause Visual Studio to continue the execution of the program, and then you'll notice my console window has gone. So if you want to see that this actually prints everything out, a Control F5, and you can see that we do count up to, you're thinking 10? No, we counted up to 9, right? So 0 through 9. The reason being is because we said, as long as the counter is less than 10, execute the loop. Once the counter reached 10, Visual Studio said, it is no longer less than 10, I'm finished with the loop, so it stops execution. So that's a very quick and simple example of the for loop. Let's go ahead and use our Control-K and Control-C to comment out that, and let's have a look at what our for each loop does. This is the next type of loop we want to look at. Control-K, Control-U uncomments that selection.